In the grand story of Abraham, the father of faith, the patriarch of nations, the man who left everything to follow the call of God, there exists a shadow, a name nearly lost to history, a life cut short, but not without consequence. His name was Haran, and though mentioned only briefly in the Bible, his lineage, legacy, and tragic end ripple through the tapestry of sacred history. Haran was not merely Abraham's brother. He was the father of Lot, the grandfather of the Moabites and Ammonites, and perhaps through his daughter Milcah, an ancestor of Rebekah, the mother of Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jewish tradition even hints that Haran's daughter, Iscah, may have been Sarai herself, the woman we would come to know as Sarah, Abraham's wife. But more than names and genealogies, Haran's life poses deeper questions. What did he believe? Why did he die before his father? Was his death an accident or a spiritual reckoning? And how did his children shape the destiny of nations? The city of Ur shimmered beneath the desert sun, its ziggurats towering like mountains of stone and brick. The Euphrates flowed nearby, bringing life and trade to the bustling Sumerian metropolis. Priests offered incense to gods with names older than memory. Merchants shouted over clay jars filled with barley and wine. And deep within the heart of the city, in the house of Terah, 3 sons were born: Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Of the 3, Haran was the most jovial. Where Abram was quiet and often lost in thought, Haran was lively, drawn to festivals, laughter, and the color of life. He loved the smell of roasted lamb, the rhythm of flutes, and the stories told around firelight. Though the youngest of the brothers, he was the first to marry and the first to build a family. His wife, whose name has been lost to time, bore him 3 children: Lot, Milcah, and Iscah. Haran took pride in his children, particularly in Lot, who followed him like a shadow. He taught the boy how to ride camels, how to read the stars, and how to trade spices from distant lands. Terah, their father, was a man of status in Ur, a craftsman of idols, respected among the people for shaping the forms of gods in clay and stone. His house was filled with images of Nana, Enki, and Inanna. And though Haran joined in the rituals of his father, offering incense and sacrifices, he occasionally found himself watching Abram with curiosity. Abram refused to bow. He would stand, arms crossed, as others knelt before the idols. He spoke of a nameless God, one who could not be carved, who made the heavens and the earth. Haran often laughed this off, calling his brother a dreamer. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of night, he wondered, were the gods truly in the statues they made? Did they really hear the prayers of those who fed them bread and poured wine at their feet? Despite their differences, the brothers were close. They sat together at family meals, debated under the stars, and worked side by side in the family's business. But something was changing. Abram's beliefs were growing bolder, his refusal to participate in idol worship more pronounced. Terah's patience thinned. Haran was caught in the middle, bound by family, torn by doubt. Then came the fire. The temple stood at the center of the city like a beating heart of stone. The temple of Nana, god of the moon, was the pride of Ur. Pilgrims traveled from distant cities to make offerings. Incense rose daily from its altars, and the statue of Nana, silver-plated and wide-eyed, loomed over kneeling worshippers. Abram loathed it. He would pass by the temple and mutter under his breath, refusing even to lift his eyes toward its steps. "They worship stone and call it God," he said. "But the true God shaped the heavens and breathes into men." Haran had grown tired of the tension. He loved both his father and his brother, but their arguments had become daily and bitter. Terah warned Abram to keep silent. The city was not a safe place for rebellion. But Abram was no longer content to stay silent. One night, while the city slept, a glow rose in the east, not from the moon, but from the temple. Flames climbed the stone walls, black smoke curling like serpents into the sky. Panic erupted. Priests and guards rushed to the scene, shouting in terror. The temple was burning. Haran awoke to the sound of case. He ran, barefoot and breathless, through the alleys until he reached the temple square. Crowds gathered. Priests wailed. And there, in the shadows, he saw Abram calm, resolute, watching the fire. "What did you do?" Haran whispered, pulling him aside. Abram did not answer at first. His eyes glinted with the reflection of the flames. "They burn so easily," he said finally. "Gods of silver and wood. They do not save. They do not speak. They do not live." The guards pushed through the crowd. Someone had seen a man slip into the temple before the fire began. Suspicion spread. Abram turned to Haran. "Leave," he said. "Go home. Take your children." But Haran did not leave. Something within him rebelled. He turned back toward the blaze. Inside, the statue of Nana was collapsing, molten silver dripping like tears. Haran stepped forward, past the guards, into the edge of the heat. He would save the gods. Or perhaps he would prove something to himself. That the gods were real. That they were worth defending. He never made it to the altar. The heat overwhelmed him. His robe caught fire. He stumbled, screaming, before the priest dragged him out too late. Haran died later that night, burned beyond recognition. Abram was taken away for questioning. Terah sat in silence for hours, staring into the empty hearth. The next morning, he told his household to prepare for a journey. They would leave Ur. They would go to Canaan. The sun had not yet risen when Terah gave the command. Servants moved like shadows, loading camels with sacks of grain and bundles of cloth. The household was silent, but heavy with emotion. Haran's death hung in the air like incense that refused to lift. Abram stood by the doorway of his father's house, hands clasped behind his back. He had not slept. He had not spoken since the guards released him. His shoulders were heavy with more than grief. He carried the burden of belief, the weight of divine calling. Lot stood beside him, barely 13, his eyes hollow. He held tightly to his younger sisters, Milcah and Iscah, who clung to each other in silence. Haran's wife had not spoken a word since the funeral pyre. Terah emerged last, his beard untrimmed, his robe stained with ash. He looked older than he had the day before, older, smaller, and infinitely more human. "We go north," he said, voice brittle. "We leave this cursed place." The decision to leave Ur was more than grief. It was exile, a quiet surrender. Terah, once respected among idol-makers, had become the father of a heretic and the father of a martyr. His name was now spoken in whispers. No one would buy from him. No one would trade. The gods had judged him, or so the city believed. Their caravan moved slowly, winding through the sun-baked plains of Shinar, then northward along the trade roads. Dust rose behind them like ghosts of their former lives. At night they slept beneath the stars, the silence broken only by the wind and the occasional sobs of the children. Abram often walked ahead alone, his eyes on the heavens. He spoke to a God with no image, no temple, no altar. Sometimes Terah watched him, torn between pride and fear. His son was no longer his son. He was becoming something else. They arrived weeks later in a land lush with rivers and fields, a fertile place nestled between great hills. The local people called it Haranu, the crossroads. Terah saw opportunity there. He purchased land, erected tents, and declared they would stay. It was, to him, a fitting irony, the city that would carry the name of the son he lost. And so they named it Haran. It was here that the family began to rebuild. Lot grew into a young man, strong and serious beyond his years. Milcah, gentle but sharp-witted, helped tend the flocks and kept the records of their trade. Iscah, mysterious and watchful, followed Abram more than anyone else, quietly absorbing his teachings. But grief is not easily buried, and for Terah, the land of Haran became a tomb as much as a home. He walked its streets but rarely smiled. He traded with the locals but seldom spoke. His heart remained in Ur, with the son he could not save. Years passed. Abram's voice grew more certain. He spoke often of the God who had called him, who had promised him descendants like the stars. Terah tolerated the talk but never encouraged it. Haran had burned for less. Then, one night, Abram heard the voice again. "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." The time had come. In the shadow of their father's death, the children of Haran carried a quiet weight. They bore no titles, no divine promises like their uncle Abram. But their decisions, shaped by sorrow, survival, and the world around them, would influence generations. Lot, the wanderer of cities. Lot had once been a boy who rode on his father's shoulders, laughing through the streets of Ur. Now he was a man of 20, tall and composed, but with eyes that still looked for answers. He stayed close to Abram, drawn by the promise of something greater, even if he did not fully understand it. When Abram declared he would leave Haran for the land of Canaan, Lot did not hesitate. He left his sisters, his memories, and the city named for his father to follow his uncle into uncertainty. He had seen what Ur did to his father. He had seen what Haran did to his grandfather. Lot craved something new, something untouched by fire and ghosts. But Lot's heart belonged to cities. When they entered Canaan and later sojourned near Egypt, it was the bustling marketplaces and towers of stone that captivated him. He loved the energy of people, the sound of debate, the promise of gold. Abram's flocks brought him wealth, but the cities called him. When the time came to part ways, Abram, weary of conflict between their herdsmen, it was Lot who chose the fertile plains near Sodom. It was beautiful, it was rich, and it would be his undoing. In Sodom, Lot rose in status, even sitting at the city gate, a place of power. But the city's corruption ran deep. Lot's longing for place, power, and prosperity put him in the crosshairs of judgment. Angels would later come not to bless, but to rescue him from fire, the same fire that had once taken his father. From the ashes of Sodom, 2 nations would be born, Moab and Ammon through his daughters. A disturbing legacy, yes, but a legacy nonetheless. Lot, like his father Haran, would walk through fire and leave behind nations. Milcah, the keeper of lineage. Milcah had her mother's patience and her father's curiosity. She married Nahor, her uncle, in a union that raised no eyebrows among their kin, but would ripple through generations. From Milcah and Nahor came Bethuel, and from Bethuel came Rebekah, Isaac's wife, Jacob's mother. Through Milcah's line, Haran's blood flowed into Israel's 12 tribes. Though Scripture speaks little of Milcah's words or deeds, her name sits in genealogies like a cornerstone. She did not journey like Lot. She did not defy cities or witness their destruction. But she bore and nurtured the line through which covenant promises would flow. Milcah's strength was quiet, generational. She was a matriarch in a lineage that remembered Haran not as a victim of fire, but as a foundation of faith. Iscah, the veiled mystery. Then there was Iscah. She appears once in Genesis only by name. No story, no title. But Jewish tradition whispers a theory, that Iscah was another name for Sarai, later Sarah, the wife of Abram. If true, this transforms everything. It would mean that Abram did not just take a wife from his tribe, but from his own brother's house, from Haran's legacy. It would mean that Haran's daughter walked beside Abram on the long road to Canaan, laughed in the tents of Egypt, and wept in the wilderness waiting for Isaac. Whether or not Iscah was Sarah, her inclusion in Scripture, brief as it is, suggests she mattered. In a world where names of women were often omitted, her name endures enigmatic, unclaimed, but preserved. The city of Haran grew steadily, fed by caravans that passed between Mesopotamia and the Levant. It was a city of rest, a city of crossroads fitting for a man like Terah, who had never fully arrived. He aged quickly in Haran. The death of his son had sapped him, and though he built homes, wells, and trade routes, something in him never healed. His eyes, once sharp with ambition, became mirrors of loss. Abram often sat with him in the evenings, watching the last rays of sunlight kiss the horizon. They would speak little. The silence between them was no longer tense, only tired. "You see him, don't you?" Terah asked one night, without turning his head. "I hear him," Abram replied, "in the wind, in dreams, in silence." Terah exhaled, his breath shaky. "I once heard the gods, too, or thought I did. But they never answered, only demanded." Abram said nothing. He had long since stopped trying to change his father's mind. Terah sighed. "If I had believed as you do, maybe Haran would still be alive." Abram turned to him. Then perhaps Haran's death was the beginning, not the end. They did not speak of it again. Weeks later, Terah took to his bed. He no longer rose at dawn, no longer walked among the flocks. Lot brought him figs. Milcah sat beside him and read the ancient stories carved on tablets. Iscah whispered prayers over his aching bones. One morning he did not wake. He was buried in the fields beyond the city that bore his son's name. A simple stone marked the grave. Abram said the final words. Lot wept openly. The household mourned not just the man, but the world he represented. A world of stone gods, broken promises, and fading memories. That night, Abram stood alone, facing south. He had stayed until his father's death. But now the voice returned clearer, stronger. "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation." The time had come. Abram would leave. Lot would follow. Milcah and Iscah would remain. But the story of Haran, his life, his children, his influence, would continue through them all. One brother was remembered for faith. Another was remembered for fire. But together they formed the foundation of a story that shaped the world. Years passed. The land changed hands. Kings rose and fell. And yet the memory of Haran, the man, the brother, the father, remained like a quiet ember beneath the ashes of time. Abram, now Abraham, walked the length of Canaan with dust on his feet and stars in his eyes. He built altars to the unseen God, spoke with angels, and dreamed of nations that had not yet drawn breath. But he never forgot Ur, and he never forgot Haran. Sometimes, at night, when the desert was quiet and the stars burned like the eyes of eternity, Abraham would speak aloud to his brother. "I wish you had seen this land, Haran. You would have laughed at how wild it is, at how free I feel." When Lot's story turned tragic again, when the cities of the plain fell in judgment, and Lot escaped by the skin of divine mercy, Abraham thought not only of Sodom, but of fire, of another blaze long ago, of another man who faced the flames. The descendants of Haran moved like ripples across time. Lot's sons, born of desperation and survival, became fathers to the Moabites and Ammonites. Nations often at odds with Israel, yet undeniably family. Milcah's line brought forth Bethuel, then Rebekah, then Jacob, whose name would be changed to Israel. The very name of the chosen people traced back to Haran's daughter. And if Iscah was indeed Sarai, then Haran's blood flowed not just through Israel, but through the covenant itself, through Isaac, through the laughter that followed years of barrenness. In every tent that carried Israel forward, in every altar that called upon the name of Yahweh, there was an echo of Haran. He did not see the promised land. He did not speak with angels. But he was part of the story. Sometimes the foundations lie beneath the ground unseen but essential. The Hebrews would remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But every time they recited their genealogies, every time they traced their line back to Nahor, to Milcah, to Lot, they whispered Haran's name. In every act of faith there is a cost. For Abraham it was exile. For Haran it was fire. But neither lived in vain. There is a paradox in legacy that often it is those who are lost earliest who become the most deeply woven into what comes next. Haran's death had seemed like a fracture in the family. But as time passed, it became clear that it was also a fire that shaped the foundation of nations. In the generations that followed, the children of Abraham would speak of their forefathers' journey from Ur, of the God who called him to leave everything behind. But always hidden within the story was Haran, his influence passed down through blood, marriage, memory, and mystery. When the Israelites wandered the wilderness centuries later, carrying the Ark of the Covenant and longing for the land promised to their ancestor Abraham, they too carried Haran's legacy. Moab and Ammon, born of Lot, both resisted and aided Israel at different times. Rebekah, mother of Jacob, descended from Haran's line. Rachel and Leah, Jacob's wives, were daughters of Laban, also descended from Haran's branch. In this way, Haran was not simply Abraham's brother. He was a parallel route, his life and death creating tributaries of influence throughout sacred history. The fire that took him became symbolic not just of judgment or loss, but of refining. His name lived on in the city Terah built, in the children who carried his blood, in the tension between compromise and conviction that defined his descendants. What Haran believed in his final moments, no one could say for certain. Did he run into the temple to save the idols out of loyalty to tradition? Or did he rush in to challenge them, to stand with Abram in defiance? The Book of Jubilees paints him as a man caught between gods and brothers, consumed by a decision that could not be undone. But perhaps Haran was both. A man torn between past and future, between gods of stone and a God of promise. And perhaps that very struggle, raw, unresolved human, is why his story matters. Because most people are not called to be patriarchs. Most do not hear the voice of God in the desert. Most are not written into covenant. But many are like Haran, caught in the middle of something larger than themselves, making choices in the dark and wondering if they matter. The scriptures give Haran only a few verses, but history whispers more. In the names of nations, in the bloodlines of matriarchs, in the firelight reflections of prophets, he was not the chosen one, but he helped shape the path of the one who was, and perhaps that is legacy enough. History is not always fair in its remembering. It exalts the victors, the visionaries, the voices that echo from mountaintops. But in its margins lie the stories of those who made the mountaintops possible, those whose lives burned brightly for a brief moment, then faded into the dust of forgotten roads and lost cities. Haran was one such man, The scribes did not write long psalms in his name. No covenant was made with him. He did not speak with God in visions or walk between animal sacrifices in divine ritual. He did not split seas or receive laws carved by fire. And yet, without Haran, there would be no Lot, no Milcah, no Iscah, perhaps no Sarah, no Rebekah, no Jacob, no 12 tribes. His death became a pivot, a reorientation of a family's path. His absence gave space for Abram to hear the call more clearly. His children carried his legacy into tribes and nations. His story, even in fragments, reminds us that the ripple of one life is never truly lost. In the book of Genesis, Haran's story is but a sentence. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans. But what if every life, even the briefest, echoes through generations? What if God remembers the forgotten? The land of Haran remained on the map long after the man Haran passed into the soil. The city bore his name, just as his descendants bore his image. And though history tried to overlook him, faith has a way of preserving what matters. To remember Haran is to honor the unsung builders of destiny. To tell his story is to restore the missing stones in the foundation of faith. He may have been the brother history almost forgot, but now we remember. And perhaps that too is part of the divine plan. In every great journey, there are those whose steps go unnoticed, whose names are seldom etched in stone, yet whose influence runs deep in the soil of destiny. Haran was one such soul. He lived in the tension between faith and tradition, between gods of stone and the God of promise. Though he died young, his life became the spark that altered the path of nations. Through his children, his name lived on in Moab and Ammon, in Rebekah and Jacob, perhaps even in Sarah. His story reminds us that not all legacies are carved by victory or prophecy. Some are written in quiet sacrifice, in the hidden shaping of those who come after. To speak Haran's name is to honor every forgotten figure who stood at the edge of history, and through flame or faith, helped move it forward. And so we remember not just the patriarchs, but the brothers, not only the voices that thundered from mountaintops, but those who were silenced in the valleys. For in God's tapestry, no thread is wasted. Haran's life mattered. And in remembering him, we redeem the forgotten and remind ourselves that every life, no matter how brief, plays a part in the divine story.